a fake and let them bloom, oh, bloom. Showing a fake and let them bloom.
Hi there, welcome to the Bloom Show and good afternoon. This is Sahid, your host of the Bloom Show, and the Bloom Show is brought to you by New Bloom Solutions and New Bloom Media. The purpose of this show is really to help the floral industry connect to experts, professionals, and create a voice that resonates throughout the industry, as we believe that sharing information comes power and educated decisions. And also sharing information comes unity, comes empathy. So we do ask you to feel free to copy and paste the URL and share it with your customers, your community, your salespeople, your employees. Why? Because again, knowing that we're all in this together, and the effects we'll have are just really, really important for all of us to be aware and know, because it does again make us and allow us to make better decisions. Sorry about my voice today. As I've had a lot of interviews, so trying to improve my voice, but a bit of swollen vocal cords, but it is what it is. The party must keep on going on. So we're here. And today, I'm very honored to have the time of a gentleman that his time is very valuable, and that's Professor Charlie Hall of Texas A&M. It's super important to have him on board today because he is an economics specialist and expert. With that, it's going to allow us to understand the long-term effects. We did have him on the show in December. We spoke briefly, but now it is here. The tariffs are real. The tariffs are here. I know on Thursday or Wednesday we had some confusion if the tariffs were gone or not gone. Today, we will have that answered. So I'm really excited to have him here. Again, if you are a florist, wholesaler, distributor, supermarket, this is the show for you, because it will give you real-time understanding of how the tariffs will affect us. So without further ado, allow me to invite our special guest today, Professor Charlie Hall. Thank you.
Showing a fake and let them bloom, oh, bloom. Showing a fake and let them bloom.
Hi, Charlie. How are you today?
Sahid, I'm great, man. How are you doing?
Good. I'm doing with my show host voice today, so I hope it works out. I hope it works out.
There's an old time remedy for that. It's a shot of whiskey.
Okay.
Take lemon and honey, and you
All
throw
right.
the honey and the lemon away, and take a shot of whiskey, and then that.
Charlie, I was just writing it down. No, I have to cross out everything else. I like it better that way.
Yeah.
We have Kate DeBall saying, "Hi, Charlie." Thank you, Kate.
Hi, Katie. How you doing?
I do want to let everybody know it's so important to chime in and ask your questions. We research and ask questions, but sometimes we miss things. So if you want to dive in and ask more questions, I know Charlie Hall would be open to it. We do try to make this a max of 20 to 30 minutes. So we're going to dive right into the questions, and then that'll give us time to also ask questions. So, Charlie, you ready to rock?
I am.
All right. So I know it's been pretty busy for you as well, Charlie, and I imagine many people have been contacting you. So again, thank you so much for your time and your generosity in sharing this great information that we're about to cover today. So let's jump on the first question. From an economic standpoint, how might the flower import tariffs affect pricing across the floral industry chain, from growers to wholesalers, florists, and consumers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in several different ways. First of all, whenever there's the threat of tariffs, it has an impact on the marketplace, and we saw that since the day one when tariffs have been mentioned. And
Yes.
back in the Trump administration number one, there were tariffs, but there were select tariffs. And of course, the renegotiation of the free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, right? So there were a number of things all the way back 8 years ago that caused some upheaval in the marketplace as well, particularly on lumber, steel, and those kinds of products. So, but we survived it, right? And post pandemic, we've seen a lot of economic growth, and in spite of roughly half the country feeling like the economy was not doing well. You've heard me in multiple settings, but within the floral industry, the SAF roundtables, et cetera, everywhere I went, I talked about how resilient the consumer has been.
Yeah.
And that they continued buying, and they bought not only mandatory items, but discretionary items as part of their household budget. And flowers are part of those discretionary items that they can either cut back or expand. And it's not like you use flowers to pay your rent, or you use flowers to eat, right? So although there are some edible flowers, but you don't use that as a currency in which to do those mandatory things. So, but the resiliency of the customer, I think, kind of mitigated our mindset on the potential impact that tariffs have. Now, I'm going back in history and I'm laying out a story here because for 40 years, we've been globalizing worldwide, not just our country, but worldwide. Because there was a famous economist, David Ricardo, that talked about the law of comparative advantage. And that law of comparative advantage says each country should specialize in the things that they have either a natural or technology-induced competitive advantage, and then trade. And when we have trade that occurs, then there's win-win relationships. Now, there are both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, and particularly in the fresh products like produce or flowers, sometimes non-tariff barriers in the form of phytosanitary restrictions come into play. And it's amazing how many times that you just look at between the trade between US and Mexico, how many times that phytosanitary restrictions were put into place all of a sudden when there was some price imbalance, right? To either restrict supply or to encourage supply. So it was kind of amazing if we were to restrict the importation of a product from Mexico, for example, then there all of a sudden be a new phytosanitary restriction that they would put on. So trade within this free trade environment has been metamorphosizing for 4 decades.
Wow.
4 decades, right?
Wow.
And so now, in the midst of this more isolationary, protectionist philosophy that the current administration has, then there's a great upheaval in the supply chain. And so upheaval in the supply chain is because people are just uncertain about what's going to happen. And then when you threaten tariffs, and then you say, oh, okay, just kidding, we're going to have a reprieve for 30 days, or we're going to have a reprieve for 90 days. Folks just lift their hands and just go, what? Come on, right? If we're going to have a game plan here, at least develop a game plan as a company. Let's develop a strategic response to this, and then move forward. So really the key success factor for firms, both inside the floral industry and outside, is nimbleness, right? And adaptability and being flexible, nimble, any adjective there that you want to use, and having multiple contingency plans in place and regarding whether the extent to which these tariffs are applied. Now, there's still, Sahid, a lot of misinformation that you see it even among folks who should know better. They'll have phrases, for example, and I just read one this morning. I pulled it off. It said, nearly all countries will pay a 10% baseline reciprocal tariff. And it's that pay that creates confusion, because it's not the exporting country that's sending products to the U.S. that pays the tariff. It's either a customs broker or an import entity that ends up paying the tariff, right? So it's a domestic firm that collects that 10%, that 45%, that 125% from China, right? It's a domestic firm that collects it and sends it to Washington, and that's put in to the tariff bucket, if you will. So even the language in which you see the mass media and others describing these tariffs about these countries are going to have to pay. No, we need to get away from that language from the get-go, because it's us paying the tariffs on those, and then those tariffs are basically passed on through the supply chain. Now, here's the thing. If you take the 10% reciprocal tariff that's been in place for a while, or since April the 2nd, that 10% could translate to 6% for some commodities, or 4%, or the full 10%. It depends on a couple of things. How much the exporting country, the firm that's in the exporting country sending product to the U.S., how much are they willing to lower the price to lessen the impact of that 10% tariff or whatever it is, right? And if that company is willing to split the tariff, basically by lowering their price, again, they're not paying anything, they're just lowering their price, so that the effective tariff for the importing entity is 5% instead of the full 10%. So we don't know the extent to which that's going to happen, but we know those negotiations always happen between supply chain partners. So, and the other thing we don't know is how much, and say it's a 10% tariff, how much of that is going to be passed on fully through the supply chain. In other words, that importing entity may pay the 10% tariff, but they may only pass on 6% to the next person in the supply chain. In other words, they're going to absorb some of it.
Exactly.
So we don't know what that absorption rate is going to be throughout the supply chain. So there's just a lot of give and take among the supply chain partners. And remember, we just gone through a global pandemic a few years ago, and we had to reforge some of those supply chain relationships. And so now they're being impacted from a different way.
Yep.
But the good news is that many firms are more nimble today than what they were. So they're able to respond more quickly than what they had been in the past. So we learned some lessons from the pandemic that are going to sure play out here in the wake of all this tariff upheaval.
And thank you for that, Charlie. And talking about the reprieve, just to create some clarity, the 10% is standing, correct?
Yes.
So what happened on Thursday, for some clarity of people that are listening that might have been a little out of tune or still confused, but the 10% is still standing. It's 10% on top of what existed, correct? Can we clarify that?
Yes. And then there are supplemental tariffs. There's a whole chart at the Customs and Border Protection site that you can download all of the reciprocal tariffs. I printed that off just as a show and tell here.
Awesome.
And you can print off by country and see what those tariffs are going to be above and beyond the 10%.
As of now.
Yeah, but those are the ones that are postponed for 90 days. Okay,
so for example, Colombia had 0 tariff prior. Now they have 10%, correct?
10%.
And then Ecuador had 6.8. Now they have 16.8, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And like Canada, they're still at 0 because they're part of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement.
Exactly.
Yeah. So products, fresh produce is another great example that was included under USMCA. So they're going to remain at 0. They're not going to pay any other taxes because they're part of that USMCA agreement.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
And last week we were discussing, and something came up a few times, that who's flipping the bill for that tariff and then running it for 30 days, right? So a farm or distributor will actually flip that bill, correct me if I'm wrong, will flip that bill, and then they will wait for that payment in 30 days. What is that going to cause to our economy? Because there's going to be a lot of loans that they're going to have to ask for to have enough funds to cover hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, millions of dollars within just Miami. Will that have an effect or a bubble or something of that nature?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I really don't have an inclusive answer for that
Okay.
because there's you know there are letters of credit and the banking relationships that individual firms are going to have, and I just don't know enough to really speak on that particular aspect.
That's respected. That wasn't on our questions, but it's just something that came up and I thought I would ask. I
No
was
worries,
curious.
no worries, but it
Yeah.
will because it affects cash flow.
Yeah.
That's where the
Yeah.
nimbleness comes. And those firms in the industry right now who are not short on working capital are going to be at an advantage because they've got a buffer there to be
Exactly.
able to handle the ebb and flow of those funds. But those that have a really tight working capital position right now,
Exactly. Yes.
oh man, I
Smaller,
would not want to be in their shoes.
smaller wholesalers or smaller companies that are
Well,
importing themselves.
I don't even think it's related to size, Sahid.
Okay. Oh,
It's related to financial acumen.
yeah.
And those that have been viewing cash as important from day one, and
Exactly.
and cash and working capital are synonymous, but they're
Mhm.
not exactly the same. But those that have that working capital in place are going to be, like I said, they're going to be in a much better position, small or large.
Yeah, makes
And
sense.
trust me,
As long as you have that
there's some
cash
large
flow.
companies that are not in a very good working capital
Yeah.
position, and we
Yeah.
saw that during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some of the merger and acquisition activity that we've seen, some of that's been accelerated because of poor working capital positions on the part of some, particularly those that were acquired.
Yeah. And that's what you say, being nimble, being ready
Exactly.
for things like this.
Exactly.
Could we see a floral or a hyperinflation? And if so, how might that impact consumer purchasing behavior and demand trends?
Yeah. There's going to be inflation.
Okay.
Whether there's
Continued.
hyperinflation is the real question. There's no doubt that glassware, ribbons, etc. Some of our floral supplies that we use are going to be influenced, and they're going to go up in price. There's no doubt about that. But you gotta. It's like when lumber prices, or what's another good? Oh, fertilizer prices is even better,
Mhm.
right? Say when fertilizer prices went up 400%. I'm being a little flippant, but who cared? That's 1.25% of cost of goods sold for a grower.
Mhm.
So they could go up 400%. All right, it had a little bit of an impact. But when something hits a bigger input that we use, then like the cost of flowers dwarfs the other things that go into an arrangement. And so that's the biggie that is going to have a big impact in terms of any inflationary impacts. Now, I'm not mitigating the fact that when other inputs go up, it's not going to affect us, because those in the industry who work on very low margins, they can't afford to give up, 1 or 2%. But again, depending on the working capital position and the financial strength of certain companies, they may be able to handle some of those input cost increases better than others.
Understood. And that takes me to my next question: is beyond flowers themselves, how will tariffs influence the cost of materials like sleeves, boxes, fertilizers, freight, especially glassware, everything? There's so much that comes from China. There's some that comes from Mexico. There is the Mexican glass,
Yeah,
but how is
yeah,
that going to affect the overall
yeah.
market
And India and
in India?
Vietnam. I mean, there are a number of countries that are
Yep.
going to be hit by the tariffs substantially that supply the inputs. And you mentioned some, the sleeves and the ceramic vases and the ribbon and
Mhm.
the glassware, et cetera. It's going to go up, period. It's going to go up. But again, what's that relationship between the exporting firm and the importing firm, and how they're going to share in
Mhm.
that tariff obligation, and then how much of that's going to be passed on through the supply chain, how much of it's going to be absorbed. So there's some unknowns, but one thing I know, it's going to be more expensive.
Certainly, and that takes us to the other question: what are consumer behaviors expectation based on past pricing shocks or disruptions?
Yeah. If you look at the sales of flower seeds and potted plants
Hmm.
since pre-pandemic, we were growing. I'm showing you an air graph right here. Is we were growing glacially, and then we started taking off at about a 35-degree angle during the
Yeah.
pandemic. The sales, the consumption, personal consumption expenditures by you, me, and everybody else in the U.S. started going up. And since the middle of 2022, it's plateaued.
Yeah.
Now there's these are real dollars too, already adjusted for inflation. I'm not talking about nominal dollars. So that consumption went up and it's plateaued, but it's not gone down like it has in every other economic recovery since the early 1900s. When we have an economic contraction, sales in the industry go up because of affordable luxuries. And then when everybody starts buying cars and refrigerators and furniture, then sales in our industry typically go back down to trend. But this time they haven't gone down to trends yet. So people are still spending money on flowers, seeds, and potted plants. To me, that's very encouraging. That has not dipped down yet. It's plateaued.
We're not recession proof, but we are recession resilient. Can you say that?
Well, I've always said that we were somewhat recession resistant. The words recession proof have come out of my mouth, and the Great Recession washed that from my vocabulary forever. I'm no longer saying recession proof. It's all right. So we're somewhat recession resistant. We get the shot in the arm, but it doesn't last forever. But this time, we haven't seen that dip. Now, there were a couple of times in the middle of 22 and in the middle of 23 where sales started dipping for a couple of months. I said, okay, here we go, back to trend. No, then it came back up and it stayed on that plateau. And that's where we're at right now, as of February, the latest data. Now, that February data is going to be adjusted because it's finalized by the third month out. So we had a 3-month lag. So I haven't seen the finalized personal consumption expenditures data on flower seeds and potted plants. But right now it's holding level with the plateau. To me, that's encouraging.
It's very encouraging.
And here's the other encouragement. People are still buying boats.
They did this again. I know COVID was a big thing. Boats.
I know. And it's that pace of growth has slowed down, but it's still growing.
It's interesting. Boats.
So yeah. And you had all the folks talking about how bad the economy was, and we're still buying boats. Give me a break.
And the boats is a horrible pit, a money pit. Horrible. Bad investment, in my opinion. Love boats. We're in Miami, grew up on a boat, but not something I'd be looking at. But we have a great question from Katie Dubois. Are we starting to see another 35-degree angle yet this spring? My gut is telling me yes.
Yeah,
Can you explain this question? Because I kind of get it, but I'd like a little clarity on it.
Because if you look at all flowers, but not just cut flowers, but annuals, bedding plants, potted flowering plants, and so forth, spring is where we make our money, right? Yeah. We make it in the spring and we give it back the rest of the year. And the name of the game is to give back the least amount during the rest of the year. But spring, that's big time. So in parts of the country, Katie, where spring started a little early, we saw sales increase, but I think it was 2 springs ago where spring started really early, even up in Michigan and upper Great Lakes states. And so sales took off. And then by the second week of June, they played out. Whereas it normally in that neck of the woods, it's the 4th of July is kind of the end of the season, the spring season. So this year, from the areas that have started, they look like the Sun Belt states and the Southern Tier, the sales have been relatively strong so far. So I don't know whether it's a 35-degree angle or a 30 or a 28 or 26.257, but sales have in those areas been pretty good so far. So the question is, will they go into that the month of June, how far they'll go in the month of June. Obviously, the more you go up north in the country, the later the season is, and so. But right now, it's a pretty good signal that spring is going to be pretty good, as long as there aren't these. We're being stress tested with again the announcements of tariffs and pulling back and so forth, and there's a lot of geopolitical angst worldwide, and so we're being tested in terms of our resilience. But so far, the consumer has shown that resilience.
So Katie says, "I'll take it."
Yeah, exactly.
We have another question from PTC Junior. Will this mean also florists will start switching from farm to importer?
Huh. That's an interesting question.
So you're saying going back is what you're saying, PT?
If anything, yeah, that's very interesting.
Also, florists will start switching from farm to importer. So meaning now they're buying from farm, now they're going to go back to importer is what you're saying?
Yes, because it's the importer that's paying the tariff.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're the direct importee of that imported product, you're going to be paying the tariff. So it could very well be. I think it just depends on the pricing.
After a few conversations, people are expecting that, PT.
Yeah.
I've spoken to a few people, and that's what they're expecting, that they're going to start buying out of Miami more. If that answers your question, if that was the question.
Yeah.
But they seem to be, they're going to not take that cost all at once. So it just makes more sense. And time will tell, I guess.
Yeah.
Time will tell.
It depends on the price break.
Yeah.
Versus whether or not they've got the cash flow to handle the tariff payments themselves. And then if not, they're using the importer as the banker to help finance some of that in the meantime.
Some PT, just so you know, some importers, some of the freight companies are actually making the wholesalers or distributors fill out that information where they're the ones that are going to have to pay for it. Right. So instead of them covering it, the bill's going to go directly to them, and they're going to have to take care of it anyways. So it just really depends on the company they're working with. In some cases, that's what we heard.
Yeah.
Now, as far back as you can recall, this moment feels a little bit like COVID, right?
Yeah.
Full of uncertainties.
Yeah.
What's today? What's tomorrow? What's tomorrow? Who's on first? Who's on second? What did we learn from those economic events that could help prepare the floral industry?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I've already alluded to one of them.
Yeah.
Proper working capital management. And that's
Nimble.
not necessarily in the vocabulary of a lot of firms in the floral industry. So proper working capital management. Another one I mentioned was being nimble,
Yep.
right? And having contingency plans in place, not just a plan B, but a plan C. And the more you plan ahead in that regard, the better prepared you're going to be. And planning your inventory levels, optimizing those inventory levels, no matter what stage of the supply chain that you're at. And then, just safeguarding your profit margin, making sure that you're offering price points for different, you get your A, B, C in terms of the overall quality of the arrangement and so forth, and different price points that you can hit the consumers at whatever price point that they're able and willing to pay. So I think that's part of it.
That's great point. Kate Penn came on last week, and that's exactly what you said. Have a diversification of price points in this situation.
Yeah. And that's always been something that we said folks should do, but it's oftentimes harder to pull it because not everybody has a POS system that can track those different price points and the profitability of those different price points and figure out what the optimal price points are.
Yeah.
So that's where some of the work by my colleague Melinda Knuth and her willingness to pay research helps really look at what those optimal price points are.
Fantastic. And then here's a question. It's interesting. What economic indicators or trends should floral professionals be monitoring in the next 3 to 6 months to better anticipate market shifts? Is there some key indicators?
Yeah. Well, there's a subset, and I've talked about those in all of my talks. And, obviously I take a look at the labor situation. The monthly labor report is very good to follow. But if there's one number, let's just make this super simple. One number. It's like the character Curly on the movie City Slickers, right? When Billy Crystal's character asked him what the secret of life was, he says it's one thing, but he kicked a bucket before he could tell him what that one thing was. Well, the one economic number I would follow every single month is the leading economic index by the conference board. And that leading economic index gives us a feel for what the direction of movement within the economy 6, 9, 12 months down the road. Right. So it's a leading indicator. So if I'm looking in the next 3 to 6 months, that's the very first thing I'm looking at. Right. And then I'm looking at my coincident indicators. I think it's either the St. Louis Fed or the Cleveland Fed that puts together a map of all the states and their coincident indicators, and not all states are created equal. So if you get a feel for how your state is progressing now and the economic growth within your respective state, then you can plan accordingly. If you know that your state is in an area where there's slower economic growth. Okay. And folks look at me like, there's that much difference between states? Oh yeah, very much so. So if you want to drill down to the nth degree, you look at zip code level types of indicators, but I'm not going to go there. So I went from the one number, the leading economic index. Yep. And then there's another one. The Chicago Fed puts together its national activity index, and it's 80 different indicators rolled into one. And you just keep following that trend, and there's a cutoff that when it gets below there, we're pretty much headed towards recession. And so we're still above there. So it's another tool to use in terms of, are we going up? Are we going down? What's the likelihood of recession? In fact, you can even Google the New York Fed probability of recession, and they've got a model that's based off of the yield curve, and they'll tell you the probability of recession between now and this time next year. And the Cleveland Fed has the same thing. They've got a different model, but they're usually the probabilities are roughly the same.
Well, thank you for that. And we have a cool comment here. Thank you for this. Much appreciated by Heather Waits. Thank you, Heather, for watching. Thank you for this. Much appreciated, they're saying. So thank you, Heather, for watching. And then our final question, which I came up with at the last minute, based on our conversation I had last week. And I know you're gonna do your best to answer. You'd say, look, I can't really do it, but you're a brave man, so I appreciate it. So what has the potential of affecting the floral industry the most? Devaluation of the dollar, or tariffs, or do they both work together?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, I answered all those questions. They were all different questions, but I answered them all with yes. And here's but before I go there, I just popped online real quick while you were talking about that question, and there's a 30.2% chance of recession occurring according to the New York Fed's probability model between now and 12 months from now. And
what's the average probability usually?
Well, it depends.
Okay.
And I don't get off on that, but it's not as low as what it was, because it was down, I think, to 19%. Now it's back up to 30%. So again, it just talks about how resilient our economy has been, and the strength of what the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and all the investment that we made into the economy, and how that strengthened the economy. And depending on which side of the partisan fence, you may believe that or not. But, I'm just saying what the facts are in terms of the numbers. So, but let's get to your question about devaluation and tariffs. It's a very complex, very interconnected relationship. So tariffs can lead to currency depreciation because they reduce the demand for a country's currency whenever there's decreased imports. So a weaker currency in turn can offset the negative effect of a tariff because it makes the country's exports more competitive. So I mean, Sahid, I hate to dance around this, but that I guess currency devaluation, I guess the last thing I'll say there, can have an unintended consequence because you have potentially increasing inflation like we've been talking about,
Sure.
and it makes more imports more expensive. So let me just suffice it to say both have an impact on the economy, and there is an interrelationship there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the magnitude of the devaluation versus the magnitude of the tariffs. It can have either really big effects or really small effects.
We just saw a small effect, correct?
So far.
Okay.
Yeah, so far. But that's as far down that road I want to go in terms of explaining 3 big chapters in a finance textbook.
Thank you. So Professor Charlie, I'll really appreciate it. I know the audience really enjoyed this, and we're going to continue sharing. And again, we encourage our audience to share this because this is very valuable information for everyone in the industry. And thank you so much for your time. Truly, truly appreciate it. I'm glad that we didn't just see each other one time a year for our final of the year, that this year I got a little early taste of it.
Exactly.
So I appreciate your willingness to jump in such last minute and join us, Charlie. Any final thoughts, Charlie? Anything you want to tell the industry as we go through this to keep in mind?
Oh, yeah. I'll go back to my old standby, and that's you better nail your value proposition down and have it tight in situations like this. It needs to be compelling, and it needs to really articulate the why people should buy, right? And I have there's a very wise woman in the industry who I've heard say this many times. She says, "What would people miss if your business wasn't around?" All right, and to me that gets to the essence of the value proposition. So firms need to have that nailed down. Sales staff need to be able to hit on that, just depending on what that customer needs. And right now, they need a sense of security. They need to know that we're a partner in this and that I'm not going to be standing alone. So that's part of that value proposition.
Wow, I love that, what you said. What would people miss if your business was not around?
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. Appreciate that. That's inspiring us. So that's great. One last bouquet of flowers. Oh no, 100%. Maria Daniela España says 100%. So awesome. Thank you everybody for chiming in. Charlie, have a great one. I appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the week.
Thanks for having me.
And look forward to staying in touch.
Yep.
All right. Oh wait, one more thing. Thanks, Charlie Hall, for trying to tackle the questions of impact of exchange rate versus tariff. Insightful session as ever. Many thanks, Sahid. Thank you. Sylvie's been watching throughout every episode, so thank you, Sylvie. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. And I hope you guys like the new voice. I bought it at the store. I just got it recently. It's a new model. All right. Charlie, thank you so much. I'm going to say my goodbyes.
All right. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye. So great episode as always. Charlie is always a wealth of information and insight. Truly, I did take away what would people miss from your business if it was not around. I also took away that this is just a process. We're going through this. We've been through this. We're not recession proof, but we are, I'm going to say it, recession resilient. Right. And it's very important to know that and to still know that our economy, our consumers are still confident. We are a 32% chance of a recession, but that's better than 50% chance of recession. So things are still positive, and that's what I enjoyed most of this episode, is that it was actually a positive episode. It's not gloom and doom for everybody. We've made it through things like this before, and we will continue to make it through things like this. So again, thank you to everybody for joining, and thank you for everybody that's also chimed in. We do have one last comment. Manuela Restrepo, how are you? Thanks, Charlie and Sahid. Extremely useful information. Excuse me. If you want to know what's the next show, you could always press the alert key or send us an email at connect@newbloom.solutions with your phone number. And we're starting to send out announcements on WhatsApp. So it allows you to click on the link and just watch. Really, we're not going to bombard you with every episode, but the very important, really important for the moment type interviews, we'll let you know. And I think Manuela caught that from there. And so we really want to be able to connect with you and allow you to know when the shows are on. So reach out to connect@newbloomsolutions.com. And then we have here, catch Tim Huckabee, a profitable florist, on April 29th at 1 p.m. Pro tip to boost floral sales. We're actually letting him run the show. So we're starting to do that as well, where we're having takeovers this year. So do join us on April 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, let me say goodbye here. And let me say goodbye here. Now, again, thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you for your time. And again, send out an email to connect@newbloom.solutions or reach out to me on LinkedIn. If there's any episodes you think we should cover or anybody we should have on. Again, we've had people reach out, hey, I want to be on the show, or you should have this person. It really helps us because it allows us to understand what the needs are, and then it allows us to bring that information, because let's not forget that this show is by the floral community for the floral community. So thank you for joining again. Have a great one.
The bloom, showing if they connect them blue.